Hello and welcome to this latest Salvage Live event. For those of you who are new here, Salvage Live is an event series co-hosted by Haymarket Books and Salvage, which is a radical print magazine published twice a year. I'm Rosie Warren, Editor-in-Chief of Salvage, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event to launch our 12th issue, This Ceaseless Storm, with Sophie Lewis and Anne Rumberger. Sophie Lewis is the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against the Family, and the forthcoming Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation. Anne Rumberger is an activist with New York City for abortion rights. For the better part of a generation, the right, especially in the US, but increasingly around the globe, has wielded attacks on reproductive rights as the main weapon in their war to turn back the clock on the hard-won gains of social movements. This campaign has recently borne fruit, as legal access to abortion evaporated for millions overnight following the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Whether this will prove to be a decisive victory for the revanchists or a moment that will galvanize further resistance remains to be seen, but it has undeniably proven the inadequacy of the liberal strategy of relying on the courts and voting harder for pro-choice Democrats. In the latest issue of Salvage, both Sophie Lewis and Anne Rumberger argue for a different approach, one that abandons the timidity of the mainstream reproductive rights movement and that learns the hard lessons of what brought us to this juncture. Thank you both for joining me to launch this issue of Salvage. It struck me in working with both of you on these pieces for this issue that while they're very different, Sophie, you tried to think through the consequences of the liberal defenses of abortion in the US and how they've failed to prepare us to really win ground. And Anne, you traced the origins of the evangelical anti-abortion movement, but you actually land in a very similar place, which is to say that you both insist that the pro-abortion movement must insist that abortion is political and that we must be bolder in both our tactics, strategies, and our narratives in order to turn the tide in the US. So let's start off with some history. My first question for both of you is about how did we get to this place? Where did the left get so wrong in the US that we've seen the rolling back of such a fundamental reproductive right? And maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the anti-abortion movement primarily started out as a Catholic movement, and it was organized by the Catholic Church primarily. It was more of a local, state-based, kind of decentralized movement against the state abortion liberalization laws that were being proposed in the late 60s. So because it was identified as a Catholic movement, it wasn't really of much interest to, most Protestants. It was not really until the 1970s, the late 1970s, that evangelicals became really involved in the anti-abortion movement. And there were a few reasons for this. The moral majority was a main player in kind of instigating and organizing conservative evangelicals, not only into the anti-abortion movement, but into politics and into the Republican Party more generally. And evangelicals, initially were not very drawn to the issue of abortion. Like the primary kind of activating issue for a lot of conservative evangelicals was a reaction to desegregation in the South. So once segregation, once Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 ruled that separate but not equal was not constitutional, it kind of kicked off a whole series of reaction. So in the mid 1960s, a lot of evangelical activists became really involved in supporting private religious schools that were still able to gain tax-exempt status through their kind of religiously affiliated nonprofits. And when the IRS no longer allowed those schools to be tax exempt because they were segregated, that kind of activated a lot of conservative Christians into politics. That activation was kind of not really politically acceptable anymore, kind of once the civil rights movement kind of became the norm. So a lot of anti-abortion or a lot of Republican kind of political operators used abortion as sort of the kind of next key issue to activate an evangelical base. So it was kind of an interesting moment for anti-abortion activists who, it was the issue of abortion, that kind of, that brought a lot of antis into the movement, but it didn't start out that way. I guess the other kind of interesting part of the story was Operation Rescue. And Operation Rescue kind of turned what had been a really kind of small group of protesters who were protesting outside of abortion clinics and hospitals into an actual national campaign. So Operation Rescue eventually became the biggest social protest movement following the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And Operation Rescue organized evangelical churches to participate in anti-abortion activity outside of clinics. They were founded in 1986, and they had over 60,000 arrests, according to them, from the mid-1980s until the early 1990s. So it was that militancy that brought in a lot of new recruits to the anti-abortion movement. They were also a movement that promoted conservative family values and kind of rebuilding a Christian nation. So it was much broader than fighting against abortion. And this was a movement that started out by, the sit-in movement was kind of started by Catholics who were trying to build an anti-abortion sit-in movement. And they tried to turn out their congregations, but it really didn't become a large-scale movement until evangelicals joined in the mid-'80s. It was mostly Operation Rescue and Randall Terry who were able to translate what had been kind of a Catholic-dominated sit-in movement into comprehensible Bible-based language that fundamentalists could understand, and appealing to those fundamentalists in a way that previous anti-abortion leaders who were primarily Catholic couldn't really do. So a lot of that religious justification for political action and for civil disobedience came from Randall Terry, the founder of Operation Rescue, and it also came from this very influential theologian named Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a lot of books and produced a couple of films, including this film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which toured all over the United States and brought a lot of evangelical activists into the movement against abortion. And Francis Schaeffer was kind of famous for, kind of telling conservative Christians that they could be politically engaged actors, that they could participate politically, that they could use civil disobedience as a tactic to fight for their conservative social values. And he kind of gave the religious justification for young evangelicals who were sort of looking for a more meaningful way to fight for their religious beliefs. They were kind of fed up with the, kind of mainstream right to life organizations who were much more timid and kind of engaged in really, kind of incremental legislative action, and they were really looking for ways to get more involved. And so it was Operation Rescue and Francis Schaeffer who kind of, kind of activated the kind of more militant fringe of the direct action anti-abortion movement. And we can talk more later about like the tactics involved in those direct action movements. But yeah, I would say that the between Operation Rescue and between, evangelical political leaders like Jerry Falwell and like Paul Weyrich, they were kind of the main people involved in bringing evangelicals into the anti-abortion movement.
Yeah, I mean, you cover a lot in your piece about the kind of that bringing together of that coalition, and I think you have done a lot of work about kind of tracing the way that that was kind of very deliberately and quite recently constructed. Sophie, I wonder if you could pick up on the kind of other side of that equation, kind of what the left failed to do in the same period that has kind of also contributed to that victory.
Yeah, I'm really glad that, in a way, I think you phrased it as sort of what has left done that we've got here, but then I think we needed to begin really with what Anne said, given that I think it is, largely the right's sort of fault, quote unquote. However, now that we've really laid that out, like, I do think we can and must address the failures of various feminisms and various not necessarily feminist lefts. Since the eugenics movement, really, with Margaret Sanger's sort of interest in eugenics being one of the big drivers historically of the rollout of, contraceptive and abortion facilities, especially, in lower income communities where, limiting family size was seen as a sort of moral imperative, not just for the individual, but for the sort of right to reproduction of the nation as a whole. And so what you get there is this complicated sort of intertwinement of, a certain historic feminism with, notions of, eugenic civilizing. And it's not a sort of antenatal position at all, or, I mean, not to say that antinatalism would be preferable, but it's about the production of babies as long as they're the right babies. And so there was never an emphasis in that genealogy on the desirability of empowering pregnant people to say no to, motherhood, patriarchal motherhood whatsoever. That was never part of that history of rolling out, contraceptive and abortion access. And so in a way, we're still really in the shadow of that origin point. Of course, in the long 60s, there were some more militant discourses that had to do with sort of collectivizing childcare and sort of, calling for abortion for the sake of, the no, the value of the no that one might wish to say to a pregnancy, right? Which in my book, Full Surrogacy Now, I try to talk about as a real matter of gestational labor. The controversial part being that of viewing gestating as labor is that forcing someone to gestate against their will is then forced labor, which in a liberal democracy is supposed to be an obscenity, forced labor. So instead of framing gestating as labor and therefore, abortion as a fundamental freedom, not to perform forced labor, feminists in the US, sort of in the 60s, and then in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade, which in a sense was a Pyrrhic victory, right? Thought of as a Pyrrhic victory at the time by most, I think, who campaigned for it. There's been an emphasis on the sort of the necessity of abortion for the sake of, the lives of young girls, of women, the well-being of children. There's been an emphasis on the sort of unavoidable need for abortion. And so the framing from the get-go has, even in a sense among quite radical campaigns, right? The sense is that abortion helps society stave off something worse than abortion. Whereas, I think any campaign manager could tell you that if you want something, to be brought into being, to be made available, to be generalized across the world, you don't start off by apologizing for it. That should not be the first thing out of your mouth. Like, I don't think any campaign has ever won like that. So it's important, I think, to hammer home that it was a failure to frame abortions rather than the unwanted pregnancies that they end as a bad thing that should be rare, right? And that's obviously, I'm referring to safe, legal, and rare. the mantra that was the Clintons, Bill Clinton's, and then Hillary Clinton's, sort of policy platform really around abortion. And we're in a different era today. Abortions are generally safe, although they are certainly now in the US not legal, right? The emphasis need not be anymore as it was 50 years ago on safe, right? So we can kind of I don't want to say get rid of, because obviously there are some risks associated with abortion, especially, and those are worse in a context where it's illegal. But we don't need to really bring back the coat hanger metaphor, because I think that detracts from the prime focus that I think this fight should be about, which is sort of labor and carcerality, right? Like prison abolition, fighting the criminal industrial complex, and fighting the forced regime of care that I would personally want to frame as the private nuclear household, and linking it to the politics of the family. But to just stop digressing quite so much and answer your question, safe, legal, and rare was wrong, as I say, because we don't want abortions to be rare, like necessarily. Perhaps they will become rare. I mean, in a sense, that's probably inevitable. But that's not for us to demand upfront in a context where we have none. As far as I'm concerned, it is completely appropriate to full-throatedly say we want abortions. Because abortions are sociologically proven to produce overwhelmingly good effects on people's lives. That is not a matter of debate, that's a matter of fact. What do abortions do for people and for communities? They produce well-being, relief, happiness, and even if you want to count things and measure things this way, more wealth, right? Like, more comfortable households for the children that you might have later on, right? If you have access, if you care about that kind of thing. But as I say, I think we can go further, than talking about, the benefits on children of the future of abortions today, right? Like, I think we should be able to say, even beyond saying abortion is healthcare that should therefore be available to everybody, we should be able to say abortions are, regardless of what they are, and we can return to that later, like have a debate about what they are, whether they're healthcare or not, that they are good, right? And we want them. And that's the piece that has really been missing, I think, from the left's perspective on the right, as I would call it, to quit gestational work.
Great, yeah, so much that I want to come back to later in the conversation. But for now, I know this is something you're really interested in, Anne. Is, the anti-abortion movement itself not only has this, recent and very strategic history, but it's also been kind of remarkably durable and adaptable. And I wonder, Anne, if you could talk a bit more about the kind of new iterations of anti-abortion activists that we're seeing, who are kind of appropriating feminist and social justice language, who are kind of trying to appeal to young women specifically. And, maybe again, it's not right to kind of frame this in terms of the failures of the left, but I wonder if, is there a deficiency in the way that we're talking about abortion that makes it easy for the right to do that? Can you talk a bit about your experience of that? And Sophie, maybe you'll have something to say afterwards.
Yeah, the newest iterations of the anti-abortion movement, I feel like, are really clever in how they're appropriating so much social justice and racial justice language. I mean, this has kind of always been the case, and we're just sort of seeing the latest version of this. But, it's really apparent that they're trying to appeal to young people, and especially to young women, I think, kind of using this progressive language. So, like there's a small group that's called the Progressive Anti-Abortion anti-abortion uprising, and they use terms like, we need to stop the abortion industrial complex. They call themselves pro-life feminists. They talk about the abortion industry as being one that's primarily seeking profits and not supporting people. They're talking not just about, the unborn, as they call them, but they're also talking about pregnant people. And so we're seeing a lot of these groups, sort of say that they're there to help them both. They want to help the fetus, they want to help the mother. And this has been part of a strategy that they've had for decades, where now crisis pregnancy centers outnumber abortion clinics, by a huge amount. And I think part of the reason why these crisis pregnancy centers, which are often, some of them receive funding from the state and from the federal government. They're often, religiously affiliated, but a lot of them do offer material support to people who are in a moment of crisis. And that can't really be discounted. So, that type of material support is not really coming from the state at all. So, it is a failure. It's a failure on behalf of our movements that we've been unable to provide for people, and unable to kind of link the calls for abortion access to wider calls for material support for people. The reproductive justice framework, I think, is extremely important, and we need to, kind of center that. And I think we just need to figure out, how do we make that reproductive justice framework apparent in all of our actions? Because I think that there's a reason why, this kind of this seemingly progressive language gets some traction. And that's because I think, it's so obvious to people that people don't actually have a choice about whether or not they want to have children. It's so out of reach for so many people. Like, so many people cannot afford to have children. They can't take care of their children in safe communities. And I think it's the mainstream reproductive rights movement, and kind of the pro-choice Democrats have just totally abandoned, the difficulties that people are facing as parents. And I think that, our movement has to be one that makes it easier for people to choose to become parents if that's what they want to do. And that has to come from with a greater social safety net, with actual support for parents. So those demands can be really clear. Things like, universal health care, universal child care, paid parental leave, higher minimum wage, access to affordable housing. All of those things have to be like a clear part of our demand. It can't just be that we want people to be able to get abortions, which we do. Like, people should be able to get abortions at any point, at any time, for whatever reason, and they should be free. But we also need to link those to our demands for more support for people who choose to have children. And I think the right has really been able to take advantage of the lack of support for parents and claim that they can offer that support. They can't really, they can offer limited material support through churches, through crisis pregnancy centers. We can offer more if we really wanted to, and I think, it's going to take that level of, kind of expansiveness around our movement in order to combat these, kind of seemingly progressive slogans and rhetoric that the anti-abortion movement is able to harness. But it's really fascinating just to see the number of young people drawn to the anti-abortion movement. And I think a large part of that is because there's just nothing else on offer.
Yeah, I think Anne's covered, everything I would have liked to say primarily, which perhaps means that I can just comment, that the much, popularized and rightly so at this point, distinction between reproductive rights as a framework and reproductive justice, which I'll just summarize. It's usually about pointing to the history of a kind of middle-class, white-led pro-choice organizing that focused too much on a woman's right to have an abortion and sort of failed to appreciate why a bigger priority for immigrant, Indigenous, Black, disabled and incarcerated women might rather be the fight to not be forcibly sterilized. You know, that important distinction, which I think has now, along with the healthcare framing of abortion, become like, you know, almost universally quoted and pointed to, can in fact paradoxically be sort of overdone to the point that it erases to some extent the really powerful Black working class feminist organizing that was at the forefront of the abortion access struggle historically. I sort of think Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has been making this point recently to an extent. So, you know, because in a sense that can play into the point that I forgot to mention when you asked about the failures of the left, which was partly that too much breath was given to the completely fallacious idea that abortion is a white conspiracy, you know, to unmake the Black nation, right? There was a lot of Black nationalist anti-abortion discourse that the women in Black nationalist organizations had to very painstakingly sort of contest and struggle against and unmake. But that was a successful historic conversation internal to Black movements, right? And so I think today we need to be clear that a huge proportion of the people who sort of got us, you know, gestational freedom, gestational labor freedom, was those same women who insisted on the right to have, for instance, welfare payments, regardless of whether they were respectable mothers or wannabe workers, right? The radicals who were sort of very much pushing a horizon a little like wages against housework, that sought to sort of explode the framework of the sort of public-private sort of production, reproduction structure of capitalist society, and push beyond the work society that comes from that organization, and say, you know, for now, what we need, you know, fuck you, pay me. You know, we need resources, and so there isn't, you know, that's the interesting legacy, I think, of abortion struggle, and so, you know, I suppose, the wonderful sort of dialectical formula of Sister Song, the Organization for Reproductive Justice, is this vindication of the right to make babies, the right to not make babies, and then the right to care for babies that already exist in a safe and healthy environment. And, you know, it's, as I say, it is much quoted, much pointed towards in the mainstream, but I don't think it's sufficiently thought about how actually radical, and I would almost argue family abolitionist that dialectical formula might be, right? Because I think it stretches in a utopian way the conceptual limits of the term rights, and takes us toward a horizon of freedom. It takes our fight beyond the confines of the legal system, and it makes clear that justice is something that requires abolition, right? As Ruthie Wilson Gilmore would say, like the need to change one thing, which is sort of everything, because this is about the worlding of entire environments that are conducive to flourishing for, you know, mothers, or as I would maybe say, motherers of all genders, currently structurally consigned to poverty and abjection. Sorry, I think I'm getting off your question at this point.
No, that's okay. I mean, it leads actually pretty directly into my next question, which is, I'm really interested in your focus, Sophie, on the way we talk about abortion and the kind of narratives we use to talk about it and to defend it. And in the piece, you kind of trace the move from safe, legal, and rare to the healthcare framing, which is kind of where, as you say, the kind of mainstream has now landed. And you talk about why that's not really enough, especially in a context where most people don't have access to healthcare. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about why you think feminists in the US have gotten that so wrong, and what our narratives, I mean, you've already touched on this a bit in what you've just said, but kind of what our narratives as a movement should be instead.
I think I'll focus on that last part. I think, well, just to say, it's obviously a massive victory to have generalized the healthcare framing. I don't want to be misunderstood as bashing that. It is frequently remarked that in a country where nobody has access to healthcare, it's a sort of mixed blessing, right? To yoke abortion to the healthcare sort of demand. I think it's worth, it's important, I think, and it is radicalizing, and it forces, those, liberal bourgeois feminists who are interested in saying that, abortion is not political or whatever, and in sort of continuing this tradition, as affirmed by Justice Blackmun, that the decision of abortion is fundamentally a medical one, and that it therefore lies with the physician, which is in itself quite, that's a conclusion that you can contest, to begin with, right? This idea that medical means give, bodily autonomy ceded over to the expert, to the doctor, right? But but it also means that you then say, without free socialized healthcare, no abortion freedom. Are we willing to fight that hard? I hope so, right? And I hope that in a sense maybe it can convince some feminists to go hard for free socialized, universal healthcare. And I mean, it has to be really universal. But I do also think that healthcare is a framing that encourages a certain kind of, sort of moral and respectable justification for abortion still, depending on how it is set, right? It has the potential for that. In the most radical mouths, it is simply a cry for bodily autonomy, right? The medical problem being, my anatomy has been seized by a process of gestational labor, which is extremely injurious to it, right? This is another thing I emphasize in Full Surrogacy Now and elsewhere. Pregnancy is far more dangerous than abortion. There's no comparison between the two. Pregnancy kills 300,000 people a year and injures seriously millions more, right? That's when it's working as it is supposed to, and in that sense, we need to be clear there can be no non-violence in the terrain of human gestation, right? Human gestation is an agonistic process, biologically speaking, which I can already tell, someone in the audience is misunderstanding as me saying pregnancy is bad, right? Like it's bad, boo, bad, pregnant, but no babies, babies are bad, and this is obviously not what I think. If I thought that, I would not have written an entire book about gestational care and gestational workers and how much they deserve and how richly the world ought to belong to them, right? However, it's I think never the right way to respect a group to romanticize them, right? And romanticization is basically the first and greatest error of the left vis-a-vis the maternal, right? I would rather see a discourse that was capable of giving gestating the respect it deserves, because it is a grisly and a sublime and a sometimes quite boring and banal, but certainly miraculous process, by saying, it is bananas to expect anyone to do this against their will, right? It is that the fact that it is good should also be linked to the fact that it is imperative that one do it of one's own free will and accord, right? That's what respect for gestating would mean. And respect for the, if you want, it's also respect for the fetus, because a fetus should not be gestated unwillingly, you know, and that emphasis on the value of that creativity and its refusal, right, is what I would like to see centered more. Yeah. I suppose I should finish the thought. You asked me how we should frame it. So to just fully say it, I am saying that while we don't have to frame abortion as a form of killing, that it is right and certainly possible to defend, we can, if we want, frame it that way. We don't have to be afraid.
Okay,
yeah, I think that's such an interesting provocation that you raised, Sophie, and I feel like it is something that we should talk more about, like that, that like some of this conversation is a little bit like it's an ethical conversation, like about the meaning of personhood in a way. Like, I mean, we're never obviously going to solve the question of like when life begins, and I don't think that's anything that people are interested in, but it's like, what is the moral status of the fetus? And like, how has that changed over time? Like, I was reading this book by Kristen Luker, and it came out in the 80s, and she makes the claim that I hadn't really seen before, that she claims that the moral status of the fetus was ambiguous, and that it's always been ambiguous, like across human history, across, biology and philosophy and law, and, that she kind of makes this claim that it's just new interpretations of the moral status of the fetus that kind of charges this argument about, kind of the philosophical issue of personhood. And it obviously like changes in different, kind of social contexts where, I think like in the 80s, like a lot of the kind of conversations about the moral status of the fetus was also, like an implicit statement about the role of women in society, and like, kind of larger conversations about family values. Like if the moral status of the fetus like supersedes that of the pregnant person, it's kind of, making the claim that it's not really socially permissible for women to subordinate their reproductive roles to other roles, that their primary role is that of a gestator, like that of, bringing new life into the world. And that was obviously extremely important, in that period where there's like, there was such a backlash, to the recent gains of like the second wave feminist movement. And it feels like we're in a similar position where we're like kind of seeing a similar backlash and like a similar, like rise of these like very patriarchal, kind of white Christian nationalist groups who are really invested in kind of returning to like, old school patriarchal gender norms, and like the whole like trad wife, culture, which I know has always been, it's always been around, but I just feel like, the trad wife is everywhere now. And like it's, we're seeing stories about like young women converting to Catholicism and becoming, much more religious, and like their dream is to be a stay-at-home mom and to be taken care of and to not work, to not, work in the, in the labor market, but to be, wives and mothers. So it feels like it's, that there is a connection between like, the kind of the new interest or the return to like the popularization of these traditional gender roles, and, especially among like young women now, and the kind of new, kind of fetal personhood laws that are being proposed, the kind of returning to the moral status of the fetus as being equal, if not higher, so superior to the rights of the pregnant person. So I'm just curious, like how you see those. So if you kind of see that like debate as being part of our conversation about abortion rights, like how we talk about the moral status of the fetus.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I do. I love that we are all talking to each other now. I think that's very appropriate. Like, I don't necessarily always think of this as exclusively a bioethical question, but I think you are right that I mean, it certainly is. I think it maybe isn't only, like, I don't necessarily want to think of myself as a bioethicist when I say that, you know, what if abortion is killing, then it's a form of killing that produces good effects for life in particular. It is a bioethical question, but I don't think it has to be consigned exclusively to that domain. It's political. Like, you know, I am a political theorist more than a bioethical theorist, and I'm interested in forms of non-violence that are part of revolutionary struggle for one thing, but also just the labor of people making and life making. But to actually get to your point about the sort of the forces that you're so good at describing the rise of and the current kind of popularity of. I was actually watching a segment of Tucker Carlson in a hotel room in Chicago, where because I was at a socialism conference with lots of reproductive justice panels, as you know, since you were there. But he said some extremely progressive sounding things about this is the red-brown moment, right? Where this is the moment where people can actually get recruited into the sort of brown shirts because of the appeal and the correctness, the limited correctness of things that ultra reactionaries like Tucker Carlson are saying about the undesirability of being forced to work, because he framed abortion as something that bosses are forcing on workers, right? And this is how it was tapping into the trad wife appetite. He was saying, how horrible, that we don't value baby making, and that we want our women to be working in offices, and that the corporations are forcing, America's women to have abortions, when we should be valuing the contribution they make via baby making, right? And that's that is sort of it's not close to what I say. It's the other side. It's my enemy. But he is more correct than a liberal who wants to paper over the distinction, between productivity and anti-productivity, or is not willing to embrace, the problem of class, right, at the core of all of these issues. Because I want to say, and indeed there is this like beautiful legacy of radical welfare militants who, as I mentioned, were saying the same things. Like, no, I don't want to ask for money so that I can make a good contribution to society as a housewife and a mom. I want to ask for money because I want money, right? Like, it sounds sort of almost, it sounds like something that you could confuse for a certain kind of girl bossism or something, but it's the opposite, because we're talking about anti-productivity. We're talking about, instead of valuing yourself differently, like valuing care, like giving care the same kind of dignity as you do, productive work, which, of course, care is more important. We want to, care is something that we need to like put at the heart of society. But I'm not interested in using this language of value, like refusal is good in both spheres, right? We have to be clear on that. Like, otherwise you get into these very, very scary places politically. And we have Tucker Carlson making a better case, in a sense, like for the reproductive justice element of like rejecting abortion, than a left feminist, which is a very scary place to be. But I think when we're talking about killability, we need to be very careful for this exact same reason, right? I'm not trying to make fetuses killable. It might sound like I am, but that's why I'm saying this needn't get sucked into a bioethical debate about the moral status of fetuses at every turn. Like, I'm not saying that that title that I mentioned, abortion is a form of killing and that's okay, is actually a real misrepresentation of what I say in the article, which is actually specifically that I'm not sure it's okay. Like, I'm really not sure about claims like that. Like, there is very little in capitalist society that is totally okay. Do you know what I mean? What we're going somewhere. Maybe one day, we will have, achieved a state of, technological sophistication and reproductive justice that might mean that, yeah, we can start giving fetuses the sort of moral consideration that I would like to give to non-human animals as well right now, and think about their right to not be eaten and killed, right? But for now, like, I want to suspend this whole, like, is it okay question, because what we know is that it's good, which is a different question. Like, not to be like super philosophically nerdy, but it's a different question, and so that it's true. In some cases, it might be limitedly useful to point out that, we're all inextricably bound up in killing, right? Because, the right doesn't care. Like, it knows and it doesn't care, right? Killing for them is supposed to refer to something that's done to persons, hence, chickens are not persons, so chickens aren't killed, they are slaughtered. And likewise, Yemeni fisherwomen aren't really being killed when the US drone bombs them, because they occupy a kind of less than human category. I mean, of course, we try to say different, but that's how it works. You can't gotcha people with this sort of bioethical argument. You can't, like, Brett Kavanaugh, for example, is supposed to be adamantly against murdering a fetus, right? But then you look at what he voted for in 2007 when he wanted to disabled women to have abortions. Suddenly the fetus in his eyes is killable, right? I mean, and on their side, that doesn't register, right? That you can't get anywhere, I think, ultimately, with this sort of, like, exposing of hypocrisy. We're sort of wasting our time, even though I like the chant, pro-life, that's a lie. You don't care when women die, because it's helping educate our side to open our eyes to that. But as long as we're talking to them about that inconsistency, I don't think we're really getting anywhere. But I do think there's value for us in opening up a conversation about this very, like, unfamiliar, tricky, scary question of the fact that, of course, abortion kills something. Like, that's the point. Should we be afraid? Should we always be afraid when they try and gotcha us, like, with that? Maybe not. Like, why can't we admit, like, that because of certainly people who do abortions know this, that there is something that dies, that we want to stop making live, and so that's the sort of unavoidable thing about the thing that we're trying to bring to the people, and that's maybe something that I would like to see more people get on board with.
I totally agree with you there. Like, on the whole, maybe we should recognize that, like, terminating a pregnancy is stopping the potential life of a future child. But it almost feels like, the way to combat that, or to, like, argue against that, is to then say the value of the pregnant person's life is greater. Like, it's of greater value than the potential future life of this child. So in a way, it is engaging with kind of values-based judgments. And, like, obviously those are, subjective, and they're ideologically inflected, and they're influenced by people's religious perspectives. But I find that to be like an argument that I sympathize with, of, like, placing greater value on people's personal decisions and their, and the value of them making that decision about the good life, about being able to end the future life of something that they don't want to have inside their bodies anymore. Like, that should have precedence. That should, like, be of greater value than this potential life, even recognizing that it is ending, what will be a life. it's a complicated, dynamic. So I think it's definitely not talked about enough. Just one more thing. The other thing that I have come across that I find really interesting, kind of in terms of framing these issues, is like, do we use the rights framework? Like, is claiming that we have a right to abortion, or that this is a human rights issue, like, is that the right framework for us? And we kind of talked about how it's not. It's sort of a limited framework. But it also it just like brings up some really interesting historical questions about like the anti-abortion use of the human rights framework, and kind of this moment in I guess like the late 60s, when it actually became like kind of two competing human rights claims, that like the original kind of anti-abortion claim was that, they needed to protect the right to life. And this was actually like a new position for the Catholic pro-life movement, which like originally kind of started out as like part of their, position against contraception, which was extremely unpopular and like really only of interest to Catholics. Like, there was not a lot of interest among Protestants or any other group in banning access to contraception. So it was like a kind of a conscious decision for them to divorce the kind of right to life from their unpopular position against contraception. And so they embraced the human rights framework, kind of in the late 60s. And they were able to appeal to a lot of liberal Catholics who were also against the death penalty, who were also against war, who were against nuclear buildup. They kind of used this like consistent life ethic framework, or like seamless garment framework, where they talked about being opposed to all, anything that caused death. Anything that like stopped the production of life. And it was like, that was a much more consistent philosophy and a consistent framework to be kind of against the death penalty and against abortion and against war. And now you just don't see that anymore. Like they've kind of dropped all these other, positions, and it's kind of just become about abortion, but it became this kind of competing human rights framework where we're arguing for the rights of women to terminate their pregnancies and for self-determination and bodily autonomy, and they're arguing for the rights of the unborn. So it almost, that maybe just gives us another reason to kind of drop the rights framework, or kind of think about how we can expand it beyond a women's rights issue, which was really effective, in winning us abortion rights in the 70s, but now feels a little bit, maybe it's outdated, maybe we need to do more, maybe it's too limited of a framework for us. Like, that's the maybe another reason why we should be embracing the reproductive justice framework, or thinking beyond that. Like, what other framework can we use that goes beyond human rights?
Yeah, before we move on, I just want to say to people in the audience, we are going to take some questions. So if you want to pop your questions in the chat, we'll come to those. We'll leave some time. But for now, I wonder, so far we've been in mostly in a kind of US context and somewhat in a kind of theoretical register. But obviously this isn't only a dark moment. It's really striking that the US has seen this defeat almost exactly the same time when we've actually seen a bunch of victories for pro-abortion activists elsewhere, in Argentina and Colombia, in Ireland, although importantly not in the north. But various other places have won really big victories. I wonder, what do you think that we can learn from those countries and from those movements? And I don't know if either of you want to have a stab at why the right has been so successful in the US and not in these other places. Who wants to start us off?
Oh, go ahead, Sophie.
No, I was gonna say, I mean, you have much more to say, I think, about this in general, but I would just say that I think the puritanical settler colony roots of the United States have a lot to account for, and maybe I can expand on that if we have time, but I just wanted to put that there as a placeholder. And I also wanted to just comment on how extraordinary it has been to read about the trans inclusivity of the movements in Latin America that have won abortion access, because I wasn't necessarily sure what that had looked like on the ground, but I've been spending some time reading the accounts of the people who've been fighting these fights, and it seems that one of the really like common themes has been like a total like hard line sort of refusal to capitulate to a sort of cis-sexist, biologically sort of exclusive framing of gestational politics. So that, those two things. Go ahead, Anne. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot we can learn, but these are all different contexts. So, I think in Argentina, the feminist movement there, connected abortion rights to fights against femicide and violence against women, and I think that was, really key for them to be able to build those coalitions so that it was a much broader movement than just calling for access to abortion. I think it was also spurred by a lot of murders of young women, and the slogan that they used, the Ni una menos slogan, I think captured, kind of captures the breadth of the movement, so that it was, calling attention to gender violence and the number of people who are killed, who die because of lack of access to abortion. And it was also like a direct action movement. It was thousands of people taking to the streets, kind of shutting down business as usual. It was like the street protests, I think, were what really captured the attention and put a lot of political pressure on, on the politicians there. I also saw a lot that they used the framing of social justice and public health a lot more than I think we do in the U.S. They weren't kind of talking about abortion as an individual right the way that we do here, but rather as, a question of social justice that emphasized that poor women are the ones most likely to encounter dangerous conditions when seeking abortions. And I think that they highlighted the class element of their demands much more than we've been able to do. They had a really great chant that basically went, "The rich abort and the poor die." So I think that those, highlighting that was really effective. I think also that, that there were a lot of conservative social movements in Argentina as well. So I don't think I think they were kind of operating in a similar position with the Catholic Church there being extremely powerful. Just like in the US, there are a lot of people who are organized through their churches, both Catholic churches and evangelical churches. And we just don't really have an equivalent, of kind of people who are pro-abortion to kind of organize ourselves in a national context, a national way like that. We just don't have an organized feminist movement. We don't have the equivalent of church spaces to organize people. So I think that's one really big distinction. I think the campaign in Ireland did a really good job of just having conversations with everybody about abortion, just kind of normalizing it and destigmatizing it. That campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment, which was passed in 2018, seemed to really focus on using social media and just telling stories, just to make it so clear that everybody is affected by abortion bans and repro politics more generally. And I know we have groups like that. We have Shout Your Abortion. We have this great group called We Testify. And I think we could really learn from how they kind of talked about abortion as part of healthcare. They talked a lot about kind of just individual stories. I know they focused a lot on kind of these rare cases, with people like Savita Halapanavar, who was, she had a septic pregnancy and she was killed because doctors were not able to do an abortion procedure on her because she was not close enough to death for them to save her life, basically. And that spurred a huge outcry and protests. And so I think kind of sharing these really outrageous cases really helped convince people in that case. And so I don't know how I feel about that, because I think that those are, those are obviously like really emotional appeals to people. But obviously we can't just be fighting for abortion access for those rare cases when, people's lives are in danger. Like, we need to be, making it clear that abortion is acceptable and should be available to anybody at any point in any situation. So I think it almost like is complicated for us to focus on those kind of more sensational stories, but that was a tactic that worked really well in Ireland.
Absolutely. This is not so much a reference to movement, but it is so rare for me to encounter a truly like militant pro-abortion piece of like music that I just want to shout out to the Oakland rapper TNFW Neek, who has a new song that is just going viral right now. If you haven't listened to it, check it out. As my wife remarked, right? I thought I was, a bit risque for saying abortion is a form of killing, and and it's good or whatever. But she says in the refrain of BDF, which stands for Baby Daddy Free, that she's got murder on her mind. And it's a hell of a jam. She's like, let's go, bitch, I got murder on my mind. And she says, it's a shortage on the milk and these diapers be expensive. I ain't trying to be a MILF, so I swallow all his children. I done take care of N-words, now it's time to care for me. Let's go, bitch, I got murder on my mind. And everybody is listening to this, and it's a hell of a jam. So for me, I am actually, it's one song, but I'm hopeful that the extraordinary lethargy of the mainstream, pro-choice movement in the US will maybe start catalyzing these kinds of forms of creative aggression, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore would call them, sort of from the streets, from the from the bottom of society, which might include, I don't think she's talking sort of solely, to the ruling class to shock, right? Épater les bourgeois, épater la bourgeoisie, as they used to say, about provocation and polemic. I think she's talking to her sisters, to the proletarians who might, wish to seize the means of reproduction and embrace a sort of anti-productivism within that. But at the same time, the fact that it, causes conniptions on the right isn't something that we are obliged to, find no enjoyment in. So, I think it is important as well to have each other's backs and to make jokes and to keep a certain kind of lightness, a certain kind of humor in this deeply sort of necro-political fight.
So we've had a question in from the audience, which I think you might have fun answering. So Claudio has asked, reproduction of capital is more and more being disconnected from human reproduction as material for producing surplus value. What's the relation between class struggle and reproductive freedom? Who wants to tackle that?
I can give it a stab, and you can gather your thoughts, hopefully do better than I'll probably do. I think this is basically the question that Marxists and Marxist feminists are, debating and have been for some time. It's clear to me that there's still not a wholly digested awareness of the very simple intervention of social reproduction analysis, which even though it's 50 years old at this point, but I still don't know if in every aspect of thought and analysis it's been digested yet, that the social factory and the sort of, the traditional unmarked factory, the point of production, are one factory, and that the so-called hidden abode has an even more hidden abode, or as Geordie Rosenberg calls it, a hiddener abode, which is the home, the private nuclear household under capitalism. In a sense, I would almost maybe want to question the premise of the question, the relation between class struggle and reproduction, partly because I'm skeptical about whether reproduction is a useful category of thought. That's another question. Like, I get why we would use it, and I also sometimes wonder whether the term reproduction, with its implication that there is sort of no creativity about the activities that are called reproduction, gets us into sort of mistaken conclusions as social reproduction theorists. I would say that perhaps it doesn't make sense to ask what the relation between reproduction and class struggle is, because they are the same thing, because implying that there's a separation is already going to confuse us. And so I'm sort of more interested in thinking about the sorts of biological insights that Marxist biologists such as Richard Lewontin, Donna Haraway in the 80s, and so on were saying about how, in a very real in a sense that historical materialists should take seriously, because of the materialism part of historical materialism, that life doesn't work that way, that in fact there is co-productive regeneration, and that's kind of it, right? On the other hand, the term social reproduction helps us concentrate on the part of our life-making labor that is making the worker for capitalism. But they're both happening at the same time, right? When you make your child a sandwich, kiss them, and teach them to read, you're doing uncommodified labor that for some of us, some of the time, feels very fulfilling and unalienated. And at the same time, you're doing this kind of work that is being stolen from you by capitalism. We are interested in that contradiction. Like, how do you wrest the potentially liberatory force of mothering out of the sort of the jaws of the social factory? So I guess I'm just saying that, yeah, that's the question. But it is the question.
And do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I guess just that, the mainstream reproductive rights movement, I think has been one that's been pretty, white and middle class for a long time. I think that's really starting to change now. But I think a big part of making sure that the movement is actually addressing the real needs, of people who both want to have kids and want to terminate their pregnancies, I think has to kind of take account of the past failures of the movement, which includes things we've talked about, like the, kind of history of eugenics, the history of forced sterilization, the kind of hyper focus on middle class concerns. And I think part of, kind of building, a movement for abortion access and for all other types of reproductive freedom, has to come from, kind of recognizing those, kind of racist, the racist history, that has kind of plagued the movement, the, kind of debates about overpopulation, welfare restrictions, all of those things I think have to be addressed, and just, part of our movement going forward, so that we can actually, appeal to a, kind of a broader, working class base in support of all of these reproductive justice demands.
Yeah, I have one more question from the audience, which I'm glad to get because it was actually one of the questions that I didn't get to ask you. They write, the right in the States has been really effective at weaving culture wars narratives that bring together CRT, abortion, and trans rights, in brackets, really trans existence, binding them by means of various moral panic tropes. Is there an effective way to fight back on all of these fronts? And if so, what does that look like? And I suppose I would add to that a question that I didn't get to, which is that obviously framing abortion as healthcare not only kind of connects it to the universal healthcare movement and the kind of demands for real universal healthcare, but it also potentially connects it to a trans rights movement and to trans healthcare access. And I'm really interested in whether those connections are already being made, or if you see there being a potential, if they don't already exist, for those connections to be made. So I guess I'm adding a little bit to this question.
Yeah, I think they've been the right has been extremely effective, and it's because they're coordinated. It's the same, it's the same groups that are funding and kind of coordinating all of these model legislation that we're seeing kind of copied and rolled out across all of the states against critical race theory, restricting abortion, restricting access to trans healthcare. It's all coming from the kind of the same place of kind of trying to build, or in their eyes, rebuild like a white Christian, patriarchal society where it's really only certain lives that are valued. So I think, they've been much better than our side has about connecting these issues. It sort of feels like a lot of our movements are really siloed. And each movement kind of has their singular focus, and we're not very good at, I think, at coalition building, or at least at kind of including like a wide list of demands, or sort of connecting all of these demands and connecting all of these movements. So I think that comes from that we have to just be better, I think, at coalition building between all of these different groups, and making sure that the connections are clear, and making sure that all of our movements are trans inclusive, that we're very cognizant that it's not just women that need access to abortion, and that we need to be kind of fighting for everybody. So I think, what that looks like on the ground is kind of, maybe more coordination among our different groups. Since a lot of these battles are being waged at a state level, I think it's like we just need more kind of statewide coordination of people who are fighting against on all of these fronts. But I do think we need some sort of, there's a lot of groups I think that are doing incredible work, doing direct service provision and doing education about self-managed abortion, doing mutual aid work and raising money for abortion funds, kind of doing direct action work. But it would be great if we just had more ways of coordinating with each other, kind of more ways of making sure that all these sections of our movement were kind of working together and we were strategizing together. I'm sure that's happening, on some levels, but I think we could use a lot more of it, just like more strategic state and national coordination, so that we can be, kind of as strategic as the right is, on fighting all of these, kind of all of these connected issues.
Yeah, thanks. And I would just add to what you said, that in answer to this question, that it's really important to full-throatedly insist that this framing of like culture war is itself the problem. Like, this is not a trans bodily autonomy, gestational bodily autonomy, a correct understanding of the history of slavery in this country. Those aren't culture war issues. That this is an attack on the class. I think we can be extremely sort of aggressive about that as Marxists, It is already to have lost, to concede that somehow these are like peripheral or cultural. They're not cultural, you know. And I suppose, anecdotally in Philadelphia, the people fighting against the assault on gestational autonomy are disproportionately trans women. Trans women are represented disproportionately in militant proletarian movement in the US on every front. Groups like If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, have been documenting the sorts of issues that affect, proletarians in the US across all of these axes, so cyber doxing, snitch hotlines, arrests, murder charges in the South around abortion, but also I think it's really important to link these to the sorts of surveillance and hyper-criminalization that affect, for example, warehouse workers who were sort of going to be fitted with technology that would sort of monitor their fitness, right? There were going to be like Fitbits for workers where you could dock. Sorry, I forget the name of the warehouse, but it was my friend and comrade Cade Doyle Griffiths who wrote about this in the anthology Transgender Marxism, which sort of I read as an important perspective to bear in mind, to be sort of gestational militants as well, for the same sorts of reasons, that we can't get very far being biological essentialists around gestational labor. And so, we need to be linking things like the refusal of Fitbits at work, where workers were going to be maybe docked pay if they didn't, quit smoking or lose weight, with the sorts of bodily autonomy issues that are clearly at play with reproductive liberation, but then also trans liberation, and I would add children's. The idea of children's sovereignty has disappeared so far from the horizon. I would almost argue more so than the so-called infamous proposal of the communists, that is abolition of the family, and which Kathy Weeks sort of wittily calls the infamous proposal of the feminists, which feminist history then sort of rewrote and pretended had never been raised by the women's liberation movement. But even more so, right, the idea of children's participation in society and politics, the idea that children are among the poorest, they are the poorest people in the world, and that perhaps any sort of just or socialist horizon would necessarily involve a kind of generational desegregation, and certainly the involvement of those sorts of young people we currently call children, and weaponize as sort of racial weapons in a politics of innocence, which is basically just a carceral politics. In questions like, who do they want to live with and how, right? Which, of course, those of you who know me will be unsurprised to hear is, for me, part of an anti-family politics, and a willingness that I see as really, really vital for the left to criticize the privatization of care, and to be able to say, that even if all the people who currently are reproducers or mothers in society were just magically suddenly treated with respect by courts and medical doctors and cops and social workers, and were supported and assisted and given lots of cash, it would still be necessary to deprivatize care, right? That's the sort of extra part for me. And I think it really goes together. I mean, it's important for us to mount this, because I see on the right a bunker mentality that is on almost like comic hyperdrive, like, you know, the insistence that teachers shouldn't have anything to do with children. That sounds sort of crazy, but that's actually what is sort of being said, right, on the Fox News and ethno-nationalist sorts of radio waves, that there is a deep and explicit reassertion of the idea of children as property, and of the patriarchal authority of parents over children as absolute, such that, don't sexualize my kids, I will hurt you. The settler colonial mentality that justifies and actually encourages and fantasizes violence, that is sort of imagined as defensive, against basically the existence of other people in the world, right? Like the existence of other grown-ups who might speak to your child, or who your child might speak to, right? And so that the right is sort of disappearing into the private nuclear homestead, and that makes absolute sense, I think. I believe we, need to be talking about the deprivatization of care, the socialization of the necessities of flourishing, the provision of healthcare, but also food, also leisure, also things like education in a transgenerational way, in the common realm, right? We need to be deprivatizing our lives, basically.
And do you want to add to that?
Well, I guess we're just sort of wrapping up and talking about like what is our utopian vision for reproductive freedom, and yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that, like deprivatizing care, communalizing care, supporting parents in really significant material ways. Like I constantly hear about how it's so alienating and just life draining to try to raise children in this world right now, and that definitely needs to be part of our our vision for the future too, where we're making sure that that children have autonomy and that parents can have their own personal have their own individual personhood respected as well, that their personhood does not have to be subsumed by their identity as a parent, and that I think comes in addition to all of the other things that we've asked for, that we're demanding. So having paid parental leave and free daycare and minimum wage, that's actually where you're actually able to support yourself, and housing as a human right, freedom from state violence, all of those things I think have to be part of our vision of what reproductive freedom looks like. I think the other thing that we've touched on a little bit is kind of demedicalizing some of this abortion care. So empowering people to kind of manage their own reproductive lives. I think self-managed abortion is widely talked about now. There's a lot of information out there about it, but the right is coming after that as well. Like the latest Right to Life Committee model legislation that they're strongly suggesting that these conservative states take up, it criminalizes sharing information about self-managed abortion, even suggesting that hosting a website that has information about self-managed abortion is a criminal act. So they're going after self-managed abortion, and even just sharing how to access abortion pills, in a major way. So I think just opposing all of the instances of, the right's manifestation and attack on our reproductive lives is key. Like we should be kind of showing up in the streets everywhere they show up. So that's not just kind of protecting our clinics when they show up outside of our clinics, but, every public meeting of the Right to Life Committee, every public meeting of the Federalist Society, every state Supreme Court house or city hall where they're discussing abortion bans. We need to be there, and we need to be kind of, taking to the streets and, physically putting ourselves, in the way so that this kind of, business as usual of preventing our access to care can no longer happen. And that's going to take a mass movement and a mass coordinated militant feminist movement that we don't have that yet, but I do think the energy and the passion is there. I think people want to show up to things like that, and people are organizing things like that. It just needs to be everywhere on a much bigger scale. But I really see that there's a lot of passion and momentum, for major direct action like this. So that gives me hope.
We're going to have to wrap up in a sec, but I wondered if there were particular organizations you guys want to shout out, if there are people in the audience. Obviously the most important thing is that people join organizations and get involved. But if right now they felt like parting with some cash, where do you recommend they send it to?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Anne's organization, NYC for Abortion Rights, is pretty great. Anne, what else would you add?
I would find your local abortion fund. I think the small grassroots abortion funds are able to do so much more than some of these, kind of big mainstream groups right now. So, I think Chicago Abortion Fund has been really effective. I think supporting groups in states where people are going to be traveling to. So Illinois is a major, kind of destination state now for people seeking abortions. Same with California and New York. I would find, use the National Network of Abortion Funds, to kind of find a local fund to support. But there's a ton of incredible ones, including like Buckle Bunnies in Texas. There's definitely do some research and make sure that the funds that are in states with bans are still accepting money, because that's sort of a legal gray area right now. So I would do some research before kind of donating to funds in states that have bans right now. But definitely, support those states and funds which are going to be seeing, huge increases in patients coming from out of state. Aid Access, I think, is a really good one too, that provides abortion pills, and they ship those internationally. There's a lot of great resources for, kind of finding out about abortion pills, like Plan C is a really great resource. Then there are groups like We Testify, If, When, How. I'm sure there's a million other incredible organizations out there to support. Those are just a few.
That's great. Thank you both for joining me. This was such an expansive conversation. It was a real pleasure to have you both. As I mentioned at the beginning, Sophie and Anne both have essays in the latest issue of Salvage, which you can buy in our online store. We can ship to North America and to Britain and Ireland for free. We're entirely funded by our subscribers, so if you would like to support us, you can do so by subscribing. You can also take out a digital-only subscription if you're in a place where it's difficult to get shipping to. Sorry, if you're in the EU, we know it's a nightmare. I just want to say a word of thanks to Haymarket for hosting these events. Please subscribe to their YouTube channel, which is where you're watching this. We've been on a brief hiatus with these events, but we are hoping to get back to our monthly schedule, so please do sign up to our mailing list to hear about them. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found this as valuable as I did. Great.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. Yeah.
How did that go?
I thought it was great. Really great. I thought it was really I think it's a rare conversation that can